Before the presentation of the next award, which is in the category of sound, I'd like to tell you that the Board of Governors has voted a Special Achievement Award for sound effects editing of The Black Stallion to Mr. Alan Splett. He is unable to be here tonight. It always happens. First George C. Scott doesn't show, then Marlon Brando, and now Alan Splett. But Mr. Splett, wherever you are, we'll see that your Oscar gets to you. Congratulations.
Alan Splett became the butt of a joke at the 1980 Academy Awards ceremony. But it is interesting to consider the host, Johnny Carson's words.
But Mr. Splett, wherever you are, we'll see that your Oscar gets to you. Congratulations.
Where was Alan Splett, and why did he not show up to the Academy Awards? It is unusual for an Oscar winner to not show up to the ceremony. I would later learn that there were significant reasons why he could not attend. Reasons due to his own circumstances, but also reasons that raise interesting questions about the nature of studio structures and new Hollywood approaches to the soundtrack. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's consider where he actually was, London, England, in the midst of post-production for David Lynch's The Elephant Man. Alan Splett was a significant collaborator of David Lynch's from the outset of their film careers. Before working together on The Elephant Man, Splett created the soundtrack for the short film The Grandmother. And Lynch's debut feature, Eraserhead. Lynch is renowned for his innovative soundtracks, and much of his sonic style was honed at Splett's side. The Elephant Man was to be their first mainstream film together, and it was to prove a difficult journey for them both, but in particular for Splett.
See, I believe there's something that you want to say to me. Something back there. I can't help you unless you help me, you know?
In The Elephant Man, we have to struggle to understand Merrick.
I believe you want to say something to me, don't you?
Due to his disabilities.
I've got to understand what you're feeling. I've got to understand what you're thinking. Do you understand me?
The difficulty in understanding him is key to how we relate to him.
All right, just nod your head if you can. Can you understand me? Just nod your head if you understand me.
We have to work hard as Treves and other characters in the film do.
All right.
In order to decipher what he is saying.
You do understand?
I am not an elephant! I am not an animal! I am a human being!
I became interested in the line of dialogue, "I'm not an animal, I'm a human being." Not just because it's the most emotive scene in the film, or the fact that it appears in the film poster, but rather because it showed up in a sound effects library, Sound Mountain, where I was conducting research for my PhD. Sound Mountain houses Splett and his partner Anne Krober's sound effects recordings. When I was listening to sound effects created for The Elephant Man, I came across some location sound recordings. I wasn't sure what they were doing in the sound effects library. There were 4 recordings that I found that were slated 461 take 1 and 2 and 462 take 1 and 2, which covered the dialogue for the scene. When I placed the tracks in Pro Tools, a digital audio workstation, and listened to them, I could hear and see that 461 take 1 was the closest sounding in terms of performance and sonic qualities to what ended up in the release film.
David, you'll give the cue now. 461, take 1.
Action! Now! I am not an elephant! I am not an animal! I am a human being!
I then synced up 461 Take 1 and the release film soundtrack to hear and see how they aligned. They sync up very well, but there was an anomaly. When looking at the track using isotope spectrogram, we can also see this difference, most notably the sound of a gasp of breath in the location sound recording that is not present in the release film. Let's just listen to this gasp of breath in the location sound recording. Let's listen to the release film, which has no gasp for breath. Why get rid of this gasp for breath in a film that pays such close attention to Merrick's laboured breathing and voice? It may have been the case that the inhalation was too much in a scene where Merrick physically collapses when he stands up to his bullies and tormentors. What the omission of this gasp of breath does is allow an attention to be placed on Merrick's following words. Delivered on an exhale breath, John Hurt manages to achieve what Judy Lee Vivier describes as the function of breath in acting. The voice, the vibration of sound, is the external release of dynamic expression that rides on the outgoing breath, revealing this innermost landscape. The absence of a gasp of breath led me to believe that the location sound had been cleaned up for the release film. This is a normal process for a dialogue editor. However, it's unusual for location sound to end up in a library. If dialogue tracks cannot be cleaned up, they are usually replaced using ADR, that is, automated dialogue replacement or looping. This made me wonder what it was doing in the Sound Mountain Library, and whether Splett had carried out this work himself. I would later learn that this was difficult to prove. Splett was rarely interviewed, preferring to stay out of the limelight. But in an interview for American Cinematographer, Splett discussed his earlier working relationship with Lynch on The Elephant Man. On Elephant Man, we spent 63 consecutive days with one another, longer than the duration of the principal photography. I discovered another unpublished interview with Splett when I got in contact with the German sound recordist Frank Benke, who had worked as an intern and sound trainee on Blue Velvet. Benke had recorded an interview with Splett, and in it Splett discussed some problems he encountered on The Elephant Man.
When we did Elephant Man, we agreed that we would really try to push the film a little bit off-center with the sound. Not the music so much, but the sound effects, because the music was pretty traditional with orchestra and pretty traditional scoring. But with the sound effects, that we would really try to add a slightly surreal element to the film with the presences and the backgrounds and some of the things. Not much, but just, and that got us, of course, into trouble with all the English people that were working on the film, since we did it in England. They didn't like it.
I'd not heard or read about this conflict in post-production before. I asked Anne Krober about this, and she told me that another soundtrack was created by the English crew, as they were expecting Lynch to be fired from the project and the soundtrack for the film to be replaced with something more traditional. I decided I should speak to Lynch about this while he was visiting Belfast as part of a transcendental meditation tour, and he confirmed that it had been a difficult process for himself and Splett. I think it was from Anne Krober, that there was an alternative soundtrack cut by the English crew, that they had thought that what Anne and Alan and yourself were doing was a little bit strange.
Alan, the British did not understand me and Al at all.
Uh-huh.
And Al suffered a lot on that. They do things a certain way, and it's very traditional. They're very professional, no problem about that.
Yeah.
But it became us against them or something in a lot of cases, and it was not, maybe a real great feeling for Al.
Sure.
But in the end, the director makes choices, and I was working with Al, and it wasn't against them, it was just for the film.
Sure.
So everything worked out.
Yeah. Did you ever get to hear that track that they cut?
No. All the sounds are not arbitrary, they're based on the idea and the feel of the idea, and they got to be very specific. And like I said, it wasn't against them.
Sure.
I'm sure some things they did we used.
Sure.
But in the abstract world, not.
Yeah.
In specific sound effects, probably used, a lot of things, and they were, very good at, cleaning dialogue and the technical side, very, very professional.
So Lynch confirmed that there were problems in post-production, but he did not fully confirm nor deny that there was an alternative soundtrack cut for the film. At this point I was coming to the end of my PhD research into Sound Mountain and decided I probably wouldn't get any further with this story. But in 2016, Jonathan Sanger, the producer of the film, published a book, Making the Elephant Man, and in it he mentioned some of the problems experienced by Splet in post-production, and this piqued my interest again. Alan's arrival was not universally greeted with excitement, and Coates and her editing team weren't clear on what he was going to do. They were used to more traditional sound teams, and Alan's naturally taciturn personality did little to dispel their doubts. Splet worked closely with Lynch and not the other editors, creating complex premixes for the film. Sanger noted, as neither David nor Alan knew the mixers available at Delta Sound, the mixing studio at Shepperton, Alan did most of the really complicated sound blending in the premixes that he had been working on for weeks. It made the final mix go much faster, as most of the creative work was complete when we entered the theatre, and the mix was mostly about just setting the levels. Sanger suggests as Lynch and Splet did not know the re-recording mixers, that Splet created premixes that would be difficult to be changed at the mix. This may have been the case, but another possibility is that they did not trust what the other sound crew were doing. Perhaps at this point Lynch and Splet knew about an alternate cut and were protecting the film they wanted to make during the mix. I spoke with Kroeber about these premixes, and she stated that they always created complex premixes and doesn't remember The Elephant Man as being any different to the other films they have worked on. Expanding on this post-production process, the picture editor Anne Coates in interview discussed her working relationship with Lynch and Splet.
David said, I'd like you and Freddie and the art director, I can't remember who it was, Stuart Craig, to see Eraserhead. So the three of us went down to Denham Labs for some reason to see it. And when the lights went out, we all just looked at each other and we thought, Christ, what have we let ourselves in for? Because everybody had thought how nice David was and everything. Oh, he is nice. But, he seemed very straightforward. And for this extraordinary, very, very weird. I mean, you can't even describe it. It's so offbeat, but intriguing and very interesting. And I don't think I really understood it totally, or if there is anything to understand. It took him 7 years to make, with his friend Alan Splat, who's the sound designer guy. I think they made it together, because it had fabulous sound effects and music and in it and things. I mean, the whole conception of it was very, very clever, but weird, way out. And then when we came to dubbing, he had his special dubbing person, David, and he put on the most extraordinary sounds, very interesting, some of them. Some of them were a little way off. I remember coming into the dubbing theatre when he was Treves was down in the cave looking at him and everything. And I said, what are those rifle shots going at? Are they meant to be shooting in the streets? And they said, no, those are raindrops. I said, well, they don't sound like raindrops. Whereupon they all had hysterics, and the dubbing editor lay down on the ground and things. He was very temperamental. He couldn't criticise his tracks. His ideas on the street sounds and the noises next to the Elephant Man's bedroom and things like that was so cleverly done, and the subliminal noises that we put on, which I wasn't really into at that time. And I kind of scoffed at them a bit, I have to say. But I think I was wrong. I mean, they so add to the mood of the film, and they're not things that really you're conscious of. And I did get him to take them off the tree scenes, because I thought that one should definitely have the contrast between the two, so that when you were with the Elephant Man and you were in the hospital, you had these subliminal noises. You don't know quite what they are, but not have them when you were in Treeves's house, because he wanted different ones there. And I thought that was too much. But since then, I mean, people are obviously using this quite a lot, this kind of thing.
Over the course of the interview, Coates indicated a number of issues she had working with Lynch, and it is clear that there were tensions during post-production. In trying to figure out how the post-production process was organised and scheduled, I turned to documentation published in the weekly British film magazine, Screen International. And there I found records over the course of 3 months for the post-production process. Post-production was not included every week in the magazine. It was more typically updated once a month. So over these 3 months, there were 4 features on post-production. The first mention of post-production for The Elephant Man was on the 8th of March, and the last was on the 7th of June 1980. On the 8th of March, there were 3 post-production houses mentioned: Shepperton Studios, where the editing was underway, Delta Studios, which was on the same lot as Shepperton, for effects, and EMI Elstree for post-sync and effects. The sound editors at EMI Elstree are listed as Peter Horrocks and Alan Splett. By the 19th of April, the editing work is continuing at Shepperton Studios. Dubbing is also underway at Delta Studios, and post-sync and effects at EMI Elstree. On the 10th of May, the post-production information indicates that editing is continuing at Shepperton Studios and dubbing at Delta Studios, and the final mention on the 7th of June just mentions editing at Shepperton Studios. In Screen International, Splett was only listed as working at EMI Elstree with Peter Horrocks, and was not ever listed as working at Shepperton or Delta Studios. But looking at where EMI Elstree and Shepperton Studios are located, it is clear it would be a significant commute between studios. It is unlikely that Splett was actually working at EMI Elstree. Instead, from many accounts, I assume he was working with Lynch at Shepperton or Delta Studios. Unfortunately, it's not possible to ask Splett or Horrocks about this, as both of them died prematurely in 1994. In 2018, the co-written book Room to Dream by David Lynch and Christine McKenna was published. There, Christine McKenna writes, "During this final phase of the shoot, Alan Splett arrived at Shepperton, and he and Lynch worked together alone in a room without conferring with the sound crew already in place. This was an unusual setup where Lynch and Splett worked closely together without consulting the British sound editors. In fact, Jonathan Sanger in his book throws some further light on this. When David heard that we were going to loop John Hurt to clean up some of his dialogue, he didn't object, but chose not to attend the looping sessions, much to the surprise of Anne and the other sound editors. Perhaps it was a quiet protest on David's part, but ultimately he was right. The difficulty in understanding John Merrick is part of the story. It should be difficult to understand him, just as it was for Treves. In the end, we didn't use any of his cleaned up tracks, choosing to go with his original dialogue recorded on set. So Lynch didn't agree to ADR on Hurt's lines and chose not to attend these looping sessions. It seems possible that Horrocks was at EMI Elstree conducting this ADR session without Splett or Lynch in attendance. It's very unusual for a director not to attend this ADR process. This account of there being an ADR session that Lynch did not attend or approve of may explain the location sound ending up in Sound Mountain. However, it does not necessarily mean that there was a full alternative soundtrack cut for the film. But in Room to Dream, Mary Fisk, Lynch's wife at the time of making The Elephant Man, also makes the same claim as Kroeber. But this time Fisk suggests it was a different version of the film that was presented to the executive producer Mel Brooks. While David was still editing the film, EMI edited a version without him, then called Mel and told him that they had a cut of the film to show him. Fisk continued, "Mel said, 'I'm not even going to look at what you've done. We're going with David's version.'" And Fisk explicitly states that it was EMI that was responsible for this. What is interesting about Fisk's statement in a book that is structured by McKenna's research and Lynch's response to it is that Lynch does not address this. But Kroeber recently also said the same thing to me.
Fortunately, Mel Brooks stood behind David. I mean, he just said, he's the director and I trust him 100%, and you have to do what David wants.
I followed up on these statements with Jonathan Sanger. I have a question for you. In David Lynch's recent book, Room to Dream, Mary Fisk, his ex-wife, mentions that during the editing of The Elephant Man, the EMI edited a different version of the film or the soundtrack for the film without him. Is there truth to that?
I tell you the truth, I don't remember. I never saw anything that. I was very close to it, and I don't remember anybody taking the film away from David at any point. Whether or not, if they did something behind our backs and actually did some editing, I don't ever remember having seen it. I honestly don't remember ever seeing a version of the movie that wasn't the movie that David wanted it to be. As I say, there were notes, definitely notes about things that could be cut, changed, shortened, all of that kind of stuff. But and I know I mean, it sounds whimsical that we just tossed the notes. I was with David when he said, I don't want to do this, and I said, well, you don't have to do it.
So now I'm no further along than I was 13 years ago when I spoke to David Lynch. To add to all of this, the release in April 2020 of a 40th anniversary edition of The Elephant Man comes with a collector's edition booklet with some reprints of articles published about the film. One article by Tom Huddleston makes a significant error about the post-production process. Huddleston states, "With shooting completed, Lynch took the film back to Hollywood and began the laborious process of editing and sound design in collaboration with his Eraserhead colleague Alan Splett. Lynch oversaw this re-release of the film, and yet this error made it into the collector's edition, adding more smoke and mirrors to the post-production process. What I did come to learn about The Elephant Man is that it was a difficult and complicated process for Splett and Lynch, where a unionised structure of soundtrack editing and mixing was coming into conflict with the emerging new Hollywood or Bay Area workflow headed up by what would later become an established norm, the sound designer. So while Johnny Carson was poking fun at the audacity of a below-the-line worker not attending the Academy Awards...
Ladies and gentlemen, we just heard from Alan Splett. He missed the off-ramp at the Civic Center. And he's somewhere in Ensenada, but he's on his way here.
A very real problem was being navigated in London. Given the tensions, it probably would have been impossible for Splett to return midway through the post-production phase. Whether or not there was an alternate cut made, and I'm inclined to think there was, it is clear that on this production there was a division between old studio practices and new Hollywood or Bay Area workflows being played out in England. The English editing and sound editing teams were working much like those in traditional Hollywood post-production houses. This was perhaps one of the first sharp moments where a sound designer attempts to create a soundtrack outside of these normal structures. Unlike the work of the likes of Walter Murch on Apocalypse Now or Ben Burt on Star Wars, where they had their own sound teams working with them, Lynch and Splett had to navigate a crew already in place and try to convince them of the merits of their working relationship. Not having a definitive answer as to whether there was an alternate soundtrack or film is not really the point. What I've learned through the process of tracking the clean-up of a line of dialogue and the absence of a gasp or breath is that it revealed much more about the tensions between old and new structures at a moment of great transition within the film industry.
It is not Melvin Douglas's fault he's not here tonight. He was in a carpool with Alan Splett.